Chapter 2221. If there were generous patrons like him daily, he would be able to get 3 houses in an upscale place. Cameron felt more relaxed after moving around. She suddenly heard a scream from up top and a roller coaster passing over their heads. Her eyes shone as she tugged Waylon's hand. That one? Waylon raised his brows. Are you sure? She smiled. Are you scared? He squinted. As long as you're not. Cameron ran toward the roller coaster, and Waylon followed after. They got into a car, and Cameron could see the surrounding areas and the people getting smaller and smaller as it slowly started moving and climbing upward. Since it wasn't too quick, she was suspicious. Why is this going so slow? Isn't it supposed to be fast? The other guest turned back to look at her as if they were looking at a retard. Waylon laughed. Can't you just wait for a little while? The roller coaster suddenly stopped, then Cameron frowned. Is there a problem with the electricity? The next moment, the car flew straight downward. It was so fast it felt as though they were falling and had lost their balance. Cameron screamed in a high pitch, her heart almost stopping while she grabbed the person beside her tightly. Waylon's eardrums almost burst. They turned and went up and down. Everything happened in 3 minutes. After it stopped, Cameron was still stunned. It was so exhilarating. Waylon turned to look at her messy hair and then down at her hand that was still grasping his arm. His shirt was wrinkled. He leaned in. Can you let go now? Cameron snapped back and realized that she was holding him. She immediately let go and almost lost her balance when she alighted. Waylon chuckled behind her and walked toward her to hold her. I just wasn't ready the first time. Let's do it again. Waylon thought about how she was not going to give up and went on another round with her. It was better the first time because the second time, after she got off, she rushed to the nearest bin and threw up. Waylon got her a bottle of water and handed it to her while holding back his laughter. Do you want to go again? Cameron took the water bottle but didn't speak. That gave her motion sickness. She gargled and then suddenly looked toward him. Don't you feel dizzy? Waylon shrugged. I'm very healthy. Cameron had nothing to say. That was too much. Was there nothing that this man couldn't handle? Her eyes fell on a signboard that showed an escape room. Her eyes turned evil after staring at it for a long time. After Cameron and Waylon looked at the rules for the Ghost Bride escape room, they entered. It was dark inside, and the players only had flashlights. The other players walked at the back out of fear. There was a couple, and the girl was very afraid, so she walked while holding on to her boyfriend the entire time. Cameron turned around, looked at her, and whispered, "Such a coward." Waylon suddenly held her hand, which made her jump. She looked up and shone the light on her own face. What are you doing? Waylon smirked and moved her flashlight away. Follow closely. I don't want you to go missing. She turned her face away. You're the one who's going to go missing. They had to split up because of the rules. Cameron and Waylon went into a creepy wedding room that was decorated with antiques. It was gloomy and dilapidated. This was the room of the Ghost Bride. Cameron was going to look around when a woman in a white gown and messy hair crawled out from under the bed and grabbed onto her ankles. Chapter 2222. Shit. Cameron kicked her a few times. Waylon immediately hugged her. Stop kicking. The actor removed the wig and immediately stood up, showing that he was a man. He touched his swollen face while he complained. What are you doing? I'm just an actor. That's too harsh. Cameron was insistent. It's your fault for scaring me. Waylon stood in front of her and said to the man, I'm so sorry, my girlfriend. He pointed at his head. The man grumbled and walked away. Cameron stomped on his foot and angrily said, I'm not your girlfriend, and why did you point at your head? Did you mean that I'm crazy? Waylon pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Surprised, she pressed her hands onto his chest but couldn't push him away. Waylon finally let her go when she stopped struggling and put a finger to her lips. Does it still not count now? She turned her face away as her heart skipped a beat. I never agreed. Don't assume things. She pushed him away and left angrily. Waylon wiped his lips with his thumb, thinking about the kiss. He didn't want to stop kissing her, if it wasn't because of where they were. Cameron bumped into another actor who jumped out in the corridor. As her default reaction to being ambushed, she pushed the man to the floor and beat him up again. Waylon put his hand to his forehead because he realized that he shouldn't have brought her to an escape room. Cameron was forced to end the game because she assaulted the actors and received complaints about it. They thought that she did that intentionally. She stood there with her head hanging low and apologizing like a child who had gotten in trouble. Waylon walked over. I'm so sorry. This is the first time my girlfriend has played this game, and she doesn't know the rules. I'll pay for all medical expenses. The manager saw that Waylon was sincere about it, so they talked about the medical fees and let it go. They got into the car after leaving the amusement park. Waylon rested his elbow on the shoulder of the seat and caressed her soft face with the back of his hand. You're such a troublemaker, making me pay extra on our first date? Cameron turned her face away. It wasn't intentional. Cameron suddenly looked back at him upon realizing what he had said. What date? Did he bring her to the amusement park for a date? Waylon put his hand behind her head, pulled her close, and kissed her cheek. What do you think that is? Cameron's face burned as she pushed his shoulder. Don't lean in so close. He bit her lip and pecked her. Cameron batted her lashes. His breath was warm, and it surrounded her, making her heart flutter. He finally let go after a long time. Her face was warm, and the blush on her face took a long time to go away. Cameron stared at him shyly. Have you kissed a lot of women? Waylon smiled. Are you saying that I'm a good kisser? She pushed him away and sat up straight. She didn't like following his lead. Waylon pushed her hair behind her ear. I've only kissed one woman. She asked, who? He chuckled. The one who's asking. Cameron was stunned and turned away. I don't believe you. This man was cunning and always lied to her and bullied her. If it were someone else, that person would have been in the hospital already. She could have beaten him up, but why didn't she? Waylon suddenly received a text. He squinted and put his phone away. Let's go meet someone. She pushed his hand away. No. Chapter 2223. Waylon laughed. To see my brother. Cameron paused and was curious. Coleman? Why do I need to see him? Waylon held onto the steering wheel and started the engine. As his sister-in-law, you should meet him. Sister-in-law? Cameron's face was even hotter, and she started stuttering. I'm not married to you yet and have not agreed to do so. No, I won't ever marry you. Waylon smiled and didn't speak. At Black Gold. Cameron walked into the lobby with Waylon. She looked around at the decor. It was indeed what the biggest group in Bassburg would look like, elegant and classy. Everything ran with the help of AI, holograms, and even the concierge had been replaced by AI. The employees were not required to punch in, and instead, they used facial recognition to confirm their attendance. Waylon and Cameron took the elevator to the administration office. When the employees saw him, they were all shocked because their president was supposed to be in his office. Leonard walked out of his office, saw the people walking over, and immediately walked over to him. Sir? The staff was shocked. Young Master Waylon is back? Waylon nodded. Is Colton in his office? Leonard was very friendly. Yes, this way please. Waylon walked toward the office, knocked on the door, and then entered after getting permission. Colton put down his phone and got up. Waylon. He was shocked when he saw the woman behind him and could guess who she was. Cameron looked at Colton. They looked very similar in pictures, but even more in person. There was a slight difference in their mannerism, however. Waylon was more mature and gentler. while Colton was sharper and colder, not as nice to be around. Waylon turned to look at her. "This is Cameron, Mr. Sunny Southern's daughter." Colton looked toward her and nodded. "I've heard about you." Cameron smiled courteously. The three of them sat down on the couch. After bringing the tea, Leonard left the room. Waylon picked up his teacup. "How have you been in the past half a year?" Colton was going to say something, but didn't seem to be comfortable with Cameron around. Cameron noticed that and patted Waylon's shoulder. "I'll go and walk around." She then got up and left. After that, Waylon could guess what he was going to say, so he slowly sipped his tea. "Is it about Freya?" Colton rubbed his temple. "I don't know how to make her stay." Waylon squinted and was in deep thought. "Tell me more about what happened." Meanwhile, Cameron was randomly walking around the office. She wasn't interested in the brothers' conversation and thought it was boring. She stopped at the windows in the corridor and looked out the window at the view outside. Bassburg was a busy city. The busiest part of the East Islands was not even as busy as a small corner of Bassburg. But she suddenly missed home so much. Two female employees walked past her. "Don't you think that Mr. Goldman is lowering his standards by marrying that woman? I heard that Miss Pruitt is taking care of her brother's child, and that child has psychological problems. I don't know why the Goldmans would be able to accept that. They have money. They can afford a retard or even disability, let alone psychological problems. That woman will marry Mr. Goldman with her niece, but needs him to pay for her medical bills. He's such an outstanding man. I'm sure he could get any woman, so why did he pick her?" Chapter 2224. Yes, Miss Peterson was great, and that psychologist, Miss Blueman too. I heard Mr. Goldman say that she was from his school and went overseas to study and went into psychology. She was beautiful and kind, much better than Miss Pruitt. Cameron watched while they disappeared around the corner, then squinted. The Mr. Goldman whom they were talking about is probably Wayne's brother. Cameron touched her chin. The two women were having discussions about the boss girlfriend behind his back. Interesting. In the office, Waylon ran his fingers over his watch and looked up. "Jessie Blueman?" Colton looked at his tea. "We were in the same school, but I don't remember her. I was trying to get a psychologist for Dee Dee, and she's in the field, so I appointed her. Cole, what do you think about Dee Dee?" Waylon crossed his fingers and rested them on his knee. "Do you think Freya doesn't care about you because she only cares about Dee Dee?" Colton rubbed his nose. "I was just too angry. She was pregnant but still took a risk for Dee Dee. I can't help but think Dee Dee is the only thing she cares about. It would be normal if she cared dearly about Dee Dee." Waylon pinched the cup's handle and spun the cup around. "Dee Dee didn't pop up into your lives halfway through. She's been there all along. If you've fallen for Freya, why don't you take her into account too? Freya is worried that you will be annoyed and is willing to let her father take care of Dee Dee. She took a step back there, but her mother is the reason Dee Dee now has psychological trauma. If she abandons her now, from a personal point of view, Dee Dee isn't her daughter, so she has no obligations to take care of her. However, officially, she's a guardian. She has the duty to take care of Dee Dee until she comes of age, even if she's not her child. If you're willing to raise Dee Dee with her, you'll have to deal with the stress and critique. She doesn't want to drag you along, but what about you? Cole, you know someone's past will cause immense harm, and you've seen the Pruitts. Freya has been avoiding you for the past 6 months, but aren't you doing the same too? Pregnant women are more sensitive and will overthink. If you don't see her, it will show that what she thinks is true." Colton held his fist and took a deep breath. "I admit that I haven't been taking good care of her. Why don't you tell her what you've done for her?" At least Colton didn't sit around and ignore her. He wanted to help Dee Dee and went to see Freya every day, but most of the time, it was when she was asleep. He looked away. "There's nothing to tell." Colton stared at him and chuckled after a long pause. "I finally know why Daisy is so afraid of you. How does she fit into this?" You were doing things for her good, but you never told her. She can't read minds, so how would she know what's on your mind? Some people don't explain themselves when doubted because they know that people who trust them won't question them. Colton seemed to be deep in thought. Waylon slowly got up. Don't be too harsh on women. There's nothing wrong with letting her win at least once. Colton looked at him. Are you like this with Cameron? Waylon stopped at the door. She's going to be your sister-in-law soon. Chapter 2225. Waylon left the office, stopped in the corridor, and turned to look at Cameron, who was playing with the fish in a tank. She knocked the glass and opened her mouth wide to try and scare them. He chuckled. Cameron turned around, closed her mouth, and stood up straight as if nothing had happened. You're done? Waylon couldn't help but laugh. Are the fishes fun to play with? Cameron crossed her arms and pretended to be calm, but she was feeling extremely awkward. She was trying to scare the fish like a silly girl, and he had seen it. Not really. He walked to her, stopped, lowered his head, and lightly touched her forehead. Play with me when we get back? Anyone's heart would explode when someone asked them that, but Cameron just squinted and looked at him questionably. Do you have some kink? Waylon chuckled. Only I can deal with this fish brain of yours. What? I'm a fish? Then what are you then? The fish farmer. Cameron wanted to bite her tongue off because she had set herself up for it. After leaving Black Gold, Cameron got into the car, buckled her. Waylon looked at her and squinted. Am I not enough? She stuck her tongue out. I'm asking a serious question. What was wrong with this man? He said, he does. If employees were talking about the boss behind his back in the office, wouldn't they be fired? Waylon paused and frowned. What were they talking about? Cameron told him what she had heard, then crossed her arms and leaned back into her chair. I think it doesn't matter if the woman is a good person, but talking behind their backs and involving a kid is too much. If she overheard them, it would hurt a lot. Waylon drove away, slowed down at a cross junction, and stopped at a red light. Do you know what's moss? Cameron looked at him. Why? He smiled. Moss is a low-level plant and only lives in dark and humid places, but it will never lose the courage to continue growing. She's a lot like Moss, growing up in a tough situation. Gossip won't be the thing that brings her down. Cameron was stunned and understood. You're talking about her. Maybe you're like Daisy and can become friends with her. She looked out the window when the light turned green. You sound like I will definitely be friends with her. Waylon smiled as he steered the wheel. She'll be your sister-in-law soon anyway. Cameron covered her ears. Not listening, not listening. 2 days later, at Tenet Media. Daisy just got to the office and was blocked at the door by a group of reporters. The security made a path for her and sent her in. The reporters held out their microphones. Miss Vanderbilt, aren't you afraid of losing fans by announcing your marriage? Daisy looked into the camera and smiled naturally. Why should I worry? I'm just an actress, and I hope that people will pay more attention to my work. Thank you. I heard that your assistant, Miss Pruitt, is pregnant. Is your brother getting married to her because of the baby? She thought the questions would just be about her, but the reporters changed the topic to Freya. Daisy stopped on the stairs and suddenly turned around. Who told you that? The reporter froze, then replied. We just heard rumors. Since Miss Pruitt is pregnant, it's hard for people not to speculate. We just want confirmation. Chapter 2226. Daisy responded calmly, my second brother and Freya love each other very much. They aren't getting married because Freya is pregnant. I don't know where these rumors come from, but I hope you all can stop spreading them. I don't want to hear something like this again. After she finished speaking, she went back into the company without turning her head back. Daisy went to report herself at Charlie's office. Charlie lifted his eyelids to look at her and said, You're back. Just in time. He placed an announcement on the desk and continued, The shooting for The Fog is going to start in another 2 days. They were looking for you to try the makeup yesterday, but I was worried that you wouldn't be able to make it back in time, so I helped you push it off for a day. Daisy picked up the announcement and asked, "What about James?" "He has already started shooting his part. He doesn't have any money anymore now that his father refuses to support him, and he has finally experienced the feeling of being a poor person. The effect isn't bad. At least he looks a bit like Simon now." Simon was a character that James played. He was a young lord who had fallen from grace. It was good to give James a punishment from time to time to cut him down to size. Charlie remembered something and said, "Other than you and James, the artists from our competitors will also join the shooting. All of them are good actors, so make sure you two don't bring disgrace to Tenet, especially James. Help me to keep an eye on him." Daisy chuckled. "All right." In the afternoon, Daisy called Shannon and made a makeup appointment. Everyone was ready to start the shooting when she arrived at the studio. All of the actors had finished their pre-photo shoot prep except for Daisy. She rushed up to Shannon and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Farlon. I'm late." However, she was stunned when she saw Zafir. Zafir was looking at her with a smile on his face. Daisy snapped herself back to reality and said, "I didn't know you'd be here too, Zafir." Zafir nodded, and Shannon said, "Mr. Gosling will join us as the vice director. Daisy, you go get your makeup ready first, we're going to check the effect later." Daisy followed the dressing staff into the makeup room. It took about 4 hours to finish her makeup, and everyone was stunned when she came out with her costume. This was the first time Daisy put on a Victorian-style dress. She looked extremely good and elegant in the dress. Daisy was going to play Nancy in The Fog. Nancy was a woman who lived in a brothel. However, she always dressed lavishly, and the book depicted her as a woman who was born with a noble spirit and was not willing to live a low life. It was just that no matter how gorgeous she dressed, she could not get rid of the fact that she was down and out. Daisy covered her face with a fan, and everyone could see the shadow of the frolicky Nancy through her eyes. Shannon clapped and said, "I was right about it. I've made the right decision to let you play the role of Nancy." With a smile on her face, Daisy went over to see the result. Zafir was standing beside her. He looked at the camera, and his gaze was deep. "It suits you very well." She turned her head around and smiled embarrassingly. "Why are you all praising me? Are you sure that there is nothing wrong with my costume or makeup?" Zafir looked at her and replied, "Nope. You look perfect." Daisy was stunned as she met his gaze. He was looking at her in the same way as he would look at her in the past. However, she did not know why, but felt something was different this time. She averted her gaze and said, "I'm going to change first." Zafir watched intently as she disappeared in his vision, his gaze deep. There was an unknown emotion flowing at the depths of his eyes. Meanwhile, at the office of Tenet, Knowles took all the contract documents for The Fog from the chairman. The chairman asked, "Are you interested in sponsoring this film?" Chapter 2227. Knowles chuckled as he scanned through the contract document. "Well, my wife is one of the actors in that film, so of course, I have to support her." The chairman was rendered speechless. It seemed to him that Knowles was going to invest in the film because of his wife. Suddenly, he remembered something and said, "By the way, someone has also invested a lot of money in the film because of Daisy. He's a director, and he has been in a scandal with Daisy before." Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly felt a chill down his spine. He took a look at the air conditioner, but it was not turned on. Knowles looked fixedly at Zafir's name and closed the document. "Then I'll become the biggest investor in this film." The chairman was stunned. Is he being jealous? Well, I can never understand the world of the rich. When Knowles came out of the office, Edison was waiting for him in the corridor. "Sir." Knowles stopped in his tracks and said, "I want you to run a full background check on Zafir. I want to know everything about him." He did not care about the scandal between Daisy and Zafir, because he had confidence in himself. However, he still needed to understand his enemy well, especially that fly that circled around her. At the hospital, the nurse entered a ward with a bouquet of roses in her arms. She handed the bouquet of blue roses to Freya, and she was stunned. She looked at the bouquet of red roses on the table and asked, "What on earth?" "I think they're gifts from Mr. Goldman," the nurse replied with a smile on her face, before exiting the ward. Carrying the bouquet of roses in her arms, Freya thought, what is wrong with him? Why did he give me flowers 2 days in a row? She put the blue roses next to the red roses. When Colton arrived at the ward, he saw that she was doing something with the roses on the table. She did not notice him even though he was walking toward her. He went closer to her and realized that she was counting the roses. Just when Colton was going to say something, the pollen tickled his nostrils, and he sneezed. Freya was startled and turned her head around. "When did you come in?" Colton turned his head and replied, "Not long ago." She looked at the 2 bouquets of flowers and asked, "Did you send them?" "Yeah," he replied before taking off his jacket and placing it on the bed. "I'm free today." Freya was stunned. For the past 6 months, he had been doing nothing but work. Perhaps he had grown bored of her as he kept avoiding her, and there was hardly any more time for them to spend all day together. She looked at him. "So?" Colton squinted. "You still can't get it?" Freya stood in front of the table and asked, "How am I supposed to know what you are talking about if you don't tell me?" Puffing his cheeks, Colton stared at her for a long while before saying, It has been a long time since you scolded me." Freya was dumbfounded. He approached her and placed his arms on the table, forming a circle that prevented her from running away from him. "If you're not happy with me, you can just tell me. You can scold me. I won't say anything back. Just don't ignore me." "What the hell are you doing, Colton? You're here to ask for her forgiveness. Stop acting like a kid and man up," Colton told himself inwardly. Freya looked at him and asked, "I'm ignoring you?" He did not say anything. She laughed and continued. "You're the one who's been ignoring me for the past 6 months. I was just..." Colton lowered his head and buried it in her shoulder. After he took a deep breath, he said, "That's because you are always thinking about leaving me. You keep wanting to get rid of me, and I was pissed." Freya pressed her lips tightly. She raised her hand slowly and patted his head, running her fingers over his soft hair. "Something is wrong with you today. Are you sick?" Colton raised his head and said, "Yes, I'm sick. My brain is sick, my body is sick, my entire being is sick." He looked like a cranky big cat that was pacing back and forth, asking for forgiveness from its master. Freya suddenly turned her head away and put her hand in front of her lips. Chapter 2228. Colton hastily supported her and asked, "It has been so many months. Why do you still have morning sickness?" Her shoulders were trembling. Was she crying? He grabbed her shoulders and turned her over. "Freya." There were no tears in her eyes. Colton finally realized something and pulled her hand away. She had pressed her lips into a thin fine line. Colton grabbed her chin and asked, "Are you laughing at me?" She averted her gaze. Suddenly, he landed a kiss on her lips. Freya placed her hands on his shoulder, and her gaze turned dazed for a moment. Since she did not push him away or resist, Colton carried her to the bed. At this moment, her senses returned to her, and she said, "Wait. It has been 8 months." Colton kissed her wrist, and his voice was coarse. They had only had sex once after she was pregnant. It happened about 6 months ago, when she was in the 3rd month of her pregnancy. At that time, she did not want to do it at all, and he did not finish the entire course. Her breathing was erratic as she said, "The nurse will come in." Colton chuckled. He collected her hair behind her ears and said, "I've told them not to come in when I'm here." He had tried his best to be as gentle as possible. Although it was not an easy task, he was willing to do it for the sake of the child. After everything was over, Colton held her loosely in his arms and pressed his lips against her forehead. His voice was soft as he said, "Let's make up, okay?" She opened her eyes slowly and replied exhaustingly, "Okay." Perhaps it was because of him, so she was willing to give him another chance. After Phrygia fell asleep, Colton received a call from Leonardo. He did not want to wake Phrygia up, so he went to the corridor to answer the call. His face was dark as he asked, "Have you found out who spread the rumors yet?" He did not know that the staff in his company had been discussing Freya behind his back, and no one had informed him when Freya came to see him last week. Colton went back and looked into the security footage of the lobby that day. Freya had been sitting in the lobby and waiting for him for 2 hours. She had not had her phone with her, and no one had been there to entertain her. All of them knew of their relationship, but when he asked why nobody told him that she was there to see him, they all said that they thought he refused to acknowledge her. After Freya got pregnant, he never took her to the office. He did not even take her out because he worried about her and the baby's safety. However, he did not expect some media outlet to make up a story. He did not know when the rumors started and became what she told him. The rumors even spread to the company, and the staff had been discussing it for a long time. I followed the vine to the person who started the rumor. She's a middle-aged woman who loves to play roulette and gamble. She has no relationship whatsoever with Miss Pruitt. She doesn't know Miss Pruitt either. She said she likes to gossip with her friends when they're playing roulette. It just so happens that Miss Pruitt was in the news with you before, so she felt that Miss Pruitt had her own agenda for marrying you. Colton's expression was dark. How would something that was discussed in a casino get to the media? If it really was just a discussion between women, how would the media know about it? Could it be that someone from the media was playing roulette at that time? They would make a story out of a child with a mental illness, not to mention a pregnant woman. Leonardo knew what he was talking about, so he said, but the rumors have been spread so widely that it's impossible to trace them now. A hint of coldness crossed Colton's eyes as he said, "It's not that difficult. We'll start with the person who started the rumors first." In the evening, Daisy, the shooting crew, and a few leading actors were having dinner in a restaurant as they prepared for the shooting commencement ceremony. All of them clinked their glasses, and everyone had red wine in their glasses except for Daisy, who had fruit tea in her cup instead. Chapter 2229. After Shannon finished his wine, he looked at Zafir and said, "Zeph, with your participation in this film, I'm sure it'll be a success." Even though this was the first time he participated in directing as a vice director, he showed exceptional talent in artistic production and was appreciated by Shannon. Zafir chuckled. "It's my honor that I could learn from you, Mr. Fallon." James was sitting next to Daisy. When he heard the conversation between Zafir and Shannon, he whispered, "Ha, what a poser." Daisy heard his mumble and bumped his elbow with her arm. "Stop talking and drink more wine." James went closer to her and asked, "Does this fellow have a thing for you?" "What are you talking about?" "We're just friends," replied Daisy. "Well, you think he's your friend, but he might not think the same way. I'm a man, and I know exactly what a man has on his mind just by looking at them," James said as he looked at Zafir. Zafir gave him the vibe that he had been holding himself back. Although he always presented himself as a courteous, modest, and gentle young man, he could not hide the complex emotion flowing in his gaze's depths, especially when he was looking at Daisy. His gaze was always filled with affection. He clearly knew that Daisy was married, yet he still looked at her like that. He was clearly a jerk. Zafir was swirling the wine in his glass. When he raised his eyelids, he met James' gaze and could detect the hostility from him. However, he did not avert his gaze. Instead, he raised his glass and offered him a toast. James did not want to respond to him. He planned to ignore him, but Daisy glanced at him and said, "Don't give me any trouble. There are other people here. If you cause any trouble, Charlie will scold me. If Charlie scolds me, I'll come to kill you and skin you alive." He clicked his tongue and raised his wine glass to clink with Zafir's. However, Zafir was talking and laughing with the actor playing the role of Xenos Yates next to him, leaving James hanging there. James was not upset at all. He just clicked his tongue and drank the wine himself. Daisy pressed her lips tightly. In her memories, Zafir was never someone who would simply get angry at other people. Could it be that Zafir was not happy with James' attitude just now? It was already 8:30 p.m. by the time the dinner ended. Daisy stopped Zafir in the corridor. After Zafir watched as Shannon and the others entered the elevator, he turned around and smiled at her. Yeah? He had drunk a lot of wine and was a bit tipsy. His gaze was deep under the light. Daisy looked at him and asked, "Are you angry?" He chuckled. "Why should I be angry?" "Because James." "Well, that's how he is, so I hope you won't take it to heart. If you're angry with him, I'll apologize to you on his behalf." She was helping James because she had promised Charlie she would look after him. Zafir and James were both her friends, and they were going to work together on a film. Zafir was the vice director, while James was one of the leading actors. If something were to happen between them, it might affect the shooting. Although she knew that Zafir was not a petty-minded person, she did not want Zafir to blame James for his rudeness. "Daisy," Zafir called her name gently. She raised her head and asked, "Yeah?" Zafir looked at her, his gaze intent on her face. "Do you know why I want to be a film director?" Daisy thought for a while and replied, "You told me that you're interested in being a film director, right?" Chapter 2230. Zafir smiled. "What if I told you, it's because of you?" "Zafir, you." She was stunned. What is he talking about? Zafir stretched his arm forward and held a strand of her hair in his hand. Something flitted across his eyes as he continued. "I'm thinking that if we hadn't left the country to study, would I have had the opportunity to be the man standing by your side instead of watching you get married to someone else?" He had always known that she liked a boy named Nolace. He had assumed she would forget about that boy along with time. He believed that as long as he stayed by her side, she would forget about him and accept him. However, when he learned that she was going for the drama, theater, and film department in Yarramore, he thought that if he could reunite with her, he would want to stand by her side. As such, he had given up the finance and business school and taken the directing course. By the time he returned to Zlokova, everything had changed. She still married the boy she liked in the end. As such, what was the point for everything he did? Daisy was dumbfounded. She did not expect him to say something like that at all. She did not know how to respond, so she asked, "Are you drunk, Zafir?" Suddenly, she seemed to be able to read the emotion in his eyes. Even though he was still looking at her in the same way as he looked at her in the past, she could detect a man's desire for a woman in his eyes. Daisy took a step back subconsciously and said, "Zafir, I'll go get someone to send you back." Just when she turned around, Zafir grabbed her wrist and pulled her into his arms. Daisy froze, and someone rushed out of nowhere and pushed Zafir away before she could say anything. Zafir slammed into the wall and hissed in pain. He lifted his eyelids and looked at James, who was standing in front of Daisy. James said, "Oh, I didn't know it was you, Mr. Gosling. I thought some brat was getting handsy with Miss Vanderbilt." Zafir bit the inner side of his cheek and stood up straight. As he dusted down his suit, he said, "It seems to me that you don't like me very much, Mr. Tails." "Why would you think like that? You're the vice director, while I'm just one of the main actors. I have to work with you in this shooting, and in case you make things hard for me, I'll be in trouble." Zafir squinted and looked at him. Daisy tugged at James as a sign to ask him to stop talking. She looked at Zafir and said, "Zafir, I'm sorry. We'll be leaving first." She did not know how to face Zafir right now. She knew that Zafir was confessing to her, and she was terrified when he pulled her into his arms just now. However, she had always treated Zafir like her big brother the whole time. Since when did that change? After they came out of the restaurant, James pulled his arm away and said, "Hey, you should be grateful that I'm still there. If not, you'd be in big trouble." Daisy's head was a muddled mess right now. She did not know how to react in that kind of situation. James scratched his head, and just when he was about to say something, he saw someone getting out of the car. "Oh, your honey is here." Daisy turned her head around. When she saw Nolace, she ran over to him and threw herself into his arms. Nolace took a step back from the impact. After he regained his balance, he wrapped his arms around her and asked, "What happened?" James came over and said, "What happened? You wouldn't be seeing her right now if I didn't show up in time. I'm right about Zafir. He has a thing for your wife, so keep an eye on her." Nala's face sank when James mentioned Zafir. He looked at James and said, "Thank you." James waved his hand and said, "Don't mention it." Holding Daisy in his arms, Nolace carried her into the car. Daisy leaned on his chest without saying anything when they were on their way back. While Nolace was stroking her hair, he lowered his head and looked at her.